All right, awesome. Welcome to this episode of Inside the Gilded Age. My name is Kevin O'Leary. I'm the Director of Marketing for the Preservation Society of Newport County, filling in for our fearless leader, Trudy Cox. And it is my pleasure to chat today with food culture historian Becky Diamond on Gilded Age dining. With the holidays coming up, I thought it'd be a wonderful time to talk about Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners, as well as the innovations the Gilded Age brought to dining across the country. A bit of a background: Becky's the author of The $1,000 Dinner, Mrs. Goodfellow, The Story of America's First Cooking School, The Gilded Age Cookbook, and most recently, The Gilded Age Christmas Cookbook, apropos, some of the best sellers in our 5 Newport Mansion stores. Becky, we sell a ton of your books.
Oh, that's good to hear.
Yeah, it is. I'm not just buttering you up. The really hard questions are coming up next. She's a business librarian at Rutgers University and also a featured speaker was a featured speaker at the Newport Symposium. So welcome, Becky. Thanks so much for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me. And well, number one, I'm thrilled to do this podcast, and I can't wait to go next week to the symposium. I love Newport and used it a lot in my research because obviously that's where a lot of the Gilded Age folks used to love to go, and people still do. So yeah.
Yeah, it's great. And with certainly with HBO's help, we've got a bit of a new audience. And I changed my background, if you can see. Can you name the
It's
kitchen behind me?
it's the Elms Kitchen.
You got that right. It is one of the stars of the Gilded Age. Anyway,
Mhm.
Becky, did I miss anything? Is there anything before we get started? Anything you wanted to add to my very brief introduction of who you are and what you've done?
No, I thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I guess the only other thing is I'm still continually writing about food and history, especially that intersection. And my current project is going to be a history of the City Tavern restaurant, which was in Philadelphia and very integral to the revolution and all of that time frame in colonial America. And we're tying it to the next year's 250th anniversary of the country. After that, I'm working on actually Edith Wharton's recipe book. Believe it or not, that's going to be so exciting. I can't wait. It
Amazing.
kind of just appeared in my lap. Somebody has access, and we're going to work on that together. So I'm very
Wow, so
excited about
exciting.
that.
How did
Yeah.
you, not to go too deep, but how did you get interested in, I don't know, how would you describe it? Antiquated cuisine, or what's the
Yeah.
term?
It definitely is food history, and I've started to focus on the 19th century for the most part because it fascinates me with all the innovations and technology that was happening, and to me, so much that we can learn about history through food. And it really just happened with my first book, which Mrs. Goodfellow, The Story of America's First Cooking School, and my kids were younger, and as by trade, I'm a journalist and I have a library degree. So I love that research and writing. And we moved to the town where I still am here in Yardley, PA. And down the street was an editor of a small publisher. And I just pitched it to him. And now we're like best friends. So it's
Wow.
all really, our families are friends. And it's just so funny. But yeah, like that's what really kicked it off. And then I was blogging about food, trying to recreate the recipes, and that's what these cookbooks are all about, because you can't just take those recipes from back in time and make them verbatim. It doesn't
Right,
turn out. So
right.
that somebody has to do that due diligence of trying to recreate them, and that's what I do. And I had been doing that on my blog, and I said, well, why not put it into a cookbook and add the history, and just there's some family recipes and all of that. So that's how it really morphed, evolved from there.
So cool. So it's so interesting. So we of course, Newport Mansions, our sliver of history is the Gilded Age. And the Gilded Age, especially the elms behind me, brought so many innovative technologies to this country. Can you explain or describe how that impacted food culture in America? I mean, did it change the way average people ate, or did it just affect the elite who could afford fancy equipment and all the accoutrement therein?
Absolutely. I mean, they probably benefited the most, but
Sure.
the railroads especially, and I always say the Gilded Age was built by the railroads.
Hmm.
That's what really all that money from the railroads really fueled the barons of industry. It was one of the main ones, absolutely. But it also allowed people not only people but goods to travel all across the country there where they couldn't be before, like so seafood could now go to St. Louis. You could transport other things, canned goods was another thing, but um, you could just transport fruits and vegetables much further without them spoiling. Years ago, people would just eat in season because they didn't really have a choice unless they had a
Right.
lot of money and had a hot house or something like that. But the
Sure.
railroads really changed the game in transporting food around the country, and then especially the refrigerated rail car. Um,
Now, did only the wealthy benefit from that? Because the Gilded Age is obviously marked by a vast wealth inequality. Was that evident, within cuisine or especially during the holidays? Not just how extravagant the houses looked, but what you were just talking about, the transport of food. Obviously, there are costs that are associated with that. So, who was there also a disparity with regards to who benefited from that?
I think there was a disparity, but this actually made these foods more available and affordable to the middle class, believe
Okay.
it or not. And they were actually starting to eat exotic foods like grapefruit and pineapple that were formerly inaccessible to them because not only the railroads could transport them, but they could can them too. The canning industries
Oh, interesting.
really helped make foods available that weren't before. Oysters now and lobster even could be canned. Now, the middle class weren't necessarily eating them, but it did make it, maybe you had it as a special treat on your
Hmm.
holiday table, but you
Right.
never even were able to have it before. So it definitely, the middle class grew during this time too, believe it or
Yeah.
not. But you know, definitely those two things really helped fuel that ability for people of lesser means to start eating a little bit better or just eat these foods that they hadn't eaten before, kind of
Right.
thing.
Right. So, sticking with that era of the Gilded Age, how did the holidays during the Gilded Age compare to earlier Victorian era traditions?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of them are the same, same and similar. You do have things like charitable organizations that did exist during the Gilded Age, and you see
Hmm.
that a little bit on the TV show, which I'm glad they're focusing on that too. But you do have like there's this Brooklyn Christmas Tree Society, and they would help make sure that children in orphanages or that had didn't have as much, means to actually have a little Christmas cheer. So I that's the main thing to me is that you do see these charitable organizations making sure that that these children could actually have some Christmas presents or even just Christmas dinner.
Right.
Um, even you guys may have already heard this, but Mrs. Frederick W. Vanderbilt hosted an annual Thanksgiving dinner at the Masonic Hall there in Newport for the newsboys that or the telegraph messengers of Newport. So there were people doing things like that to help out the the people of lesser means. But in terms of the way they were celebrating, I mean, yeah, obviously they couldn't have the same balls and parties and just really extravagant celebrations. But I do everything I've read, like if you read these ladies magazines for the middle class and
Right.
just you see it where they're giving suggestions for these women how to dress up their holiday tables. And I do think people saved up. I always use the example of the poor Cratchit family in A Christmas Carol, even
Right.
had Christmas pudding on their table. They wanted to make sure that they at least had that. So I do feel like it just wasn't as much. They might get one thing in their stocking, whereas these Gilded Age mansion kids could get,
Sure.
a slew of things.
Speaking of those magazines, I know that a lot of the sort of dining rituals or events that the privileged classes were hosting were celebrated in a lot of the women's magazines of that day, and they would offer, I think, etiquette advice like bread should be cut thin and laid on the napkin to the left, and glasses go to the right, etc. Has was that the sort of was that the birth of dining etiquette? Has that carried over to today? Has any of that carried? Was anything sort of emerged for the first time during that era?
I don't know about you know what I think in terms of that is like dressing up your holiday table. They definitely and having that greenery
Yeah.
around, like a Yule log, maybe that was smaller because the Yule log used to go in the fireplace, and burn. But then they would have those. I mean, I remember my mom had a smaller one that you could put on the table with candles in it. And then also just all of these, like they really like these lavish centerpieces for
Hmm.
Christmas time. So I think that was all part of it, and just using the colors, maybe some more colorful linens and things like that. But yeah, that's where I see it the most, like dressing up the tables and
Sure.
making sure it had that feel.
Sure. Were those holiday gatherings, sort of sticking with the Gilded Age elite? Were those holiday gatherings, was it more of the kind of one-upsmanship that you saw during, let's say, during the Newport summer social season? I'm thinking about Bertha Russell and kind of her coming out hosting her great ball and the Gilded Age at the Elms. Was it that, that kind of over-the-top extravagance, or were holiday dinners with these families, or were they more intimate?
I think if it's the Gilded Age elite, I think they're still trying to one up each other.
Of course. I
Um,
think I knew the answer to that question.
yeah, I mean, you see more evidence of that, and it always was, okay, I have to outdo the last ball kind of thing.
Right.
And, they always did that. It's funny because I know what you're saying, and I was looking for that more. I didn't see as many of those intimate dinners, and maybe just because they're not really written about as much, like for a family. There were families who actually would celebrate their Christmas dinner at hotels, especially in New
Oh,
York, because sons were home from college a lot of
right.
times and they would all meet there. And that was a good opportunity for women too to introduce their daughters to
Yeah.
young suitors. So that's what I see more for the elite. For the middle
Hmm.
class, I see them more talk, those holiday gatherings with family and
Right.
things like that, or more like in the Midwest. And because I don't think of that as much of. It's funny because the Gilded Age happened at the same time like the frontier was going on out
Right.
west,
Right.
and it was a different kind of situation out there. They were on the prairie and scraping by and things. So
Mhm.
it just, you had these different groupings of people. So it really depended. And it depended on your family background, where you came from,
Right.
and all
Right.
of that.
Back in the Gilded Age Cookbook, I think it was, you talk about Thanksgiving being one of the most carefully planned meals of the year. Who were you talking just in general terms, or did that refer only to the wealthy, or was it during that time, was Thanksgiving a time where, regardless of your means or place on the economic strata, it was true for everybody, or was it just true for the elite?
I do think, again, like we said before, the upper class, were having their level of, always has to be over the top. But the middle class were actually trying to emulate the upper class as much as they could, because that was something they strove
Right.
for.
Describe,
And
not to interrupt you, but like describe, like, how would they, if would they pretend that a certain food was another certain food? And I mean, there were these gourmet delicacies, and Pat is, my colleague Pat is way more of an historian than I am. But I see these old menus of sort of turtle soup and this kind of
mhm.
semi-exotic dishes. Would they pretend something was something else, or was it just they wanted to sort of decorate the tables and they'd skimp on food, or what did that look like? Trying
They
to emulate the
probably,
elite.
yeah, I think for the most part, then they just wouldn't have like the amount of courses. So like a
Got it.
Thanksgiving dinner for the elite would often be multiple courses of
Right.
foods. Not only that, like we've just put everything out now today, but it used to be, oh, you have a course of oysters, some soup, and the roast is the high point, and that was the same for Christmas dinner. Um, and the middle class probably couldn't do that, or they might
Sure.
just serve everything together. And you even had these cooking school instructors that especially in New York City, there were some in Boston too, that actually would teach these women that were more middle class kind of thing
Hmm.
how to cook. like they should, like how to emulate these upper class parties and things. So
How would that, not to get too into the nitty gritty, but how would that happen? Would they, I mean, was it a paid cooking school or was this sort of a more of kind of like social engineering? Like everybody needs to know how to set a proper
yeah,
place setting.
no, it's a good question because there were all groups of women at these cooking schools often. And some of them, again, were charitable. Like the Vanderbilts especially did cooking classes at the YWCA for women.
Yeah,
But you had immigrant women going at night often after they got off of work because either they were cooks in houses or they just wanted to know how to cook this American food because it was different from where they came from.
right,
Um, but then you had these debutante girls going during the day because their mothers would send them there. It's crazy, I know. The mothers would send them and say, I need you to know, even though they weren't going to cook it or bake it themselves, they needed to know how it was put together so they could
right.
tell the servants and know how to put on a dinner party. And that was going on for years. That was actually what my first book all talked about, but it still continued in the Gilded Age. And then there were also other women, just middle class, that would go in the afternoons, and they might even be kind of upper class because this was kind of a form of entertainment going to these cooking schools.
Right.
You know, you didn't have TV or internet or any of the cooking shows that we do now. So they would go
Right.
and it was like an entertaining activity and they would always learn and they really enjoyed it. So yeah.
I mean, were the classes, I'm assuming, I think I know the answer to this question, but were the classes segregated? I'm assuming that relatives of the Vanderbilts, these debutantes, weren't in the same cooking class as my
Exactly.
relatives who came over from Cork and were washing dishes in New York.
Right, exactly. They would go during the day. They often wouldn't even take their gloves off. They're just kind of looking,
I
and then
see.
the ones at night were getting their hands dirty and actually learning the cooking techniques and, getting into it and that kind of thing. So yeah, it really was eye-opening, some of this research that I did, because I think a lot of this has been lost in the
Right.
shuffle of things. So, but that's what was there were also these road shows, they called them cooking road shows, where these women would take their cooking show to packed auditoriums across, especially the up and down the East Coast, or World's Fairs, and then just, give cooking demonstrations. People ate it up. They
I
loved
love
it.
that.
Yeah.
Who,
So
during your research, was there any one person or a couple of cooking instructors during this time who were teaching these classes or maybe on the road who had an outsized influence or was sought? The debutante, the parents of the debutantes really wanted, there were a number of different cooking schools, I'm assuming. But there was one person or two different chefs who they really wanted to get the debutantes into those classes.
there were actually a few. There's one, his name was Pierre Blot. Blot, Blo, it's Blot is how you say his name, but he was from France. I know, speaking the next week, we're going to do this French, symposium, but
Yep.
I actually would love to write a book on him, and I've thought about it many times because he was known as America's first celebrity chef, and he took his show on the road, and even young men, bachelors, would go to his cooking classes. And
Was that a common thing? I mean, did men go to
I
these
don't think it
cooking
was
classes?
as common until Pierre Blot did it
Right.
because, he called it the New York Cooking Academy, his school, and he was the professor of gastronomy. It was so funny.
Was it sort
So
of was it a dating scene for young bachelors? You thought, well, this is a great way for me to show that I'm an enlightened young man and meet some pretty
maybe
debutantes?
definitely could be. So that he was a main one, and then this other woman later on, her name was Sarah Tyson Brewer. She was at the Philadelphia Cooking School. She went to the 1893 World's Fair. Companies also contracted with these women for pure food fairs so
Hmm.
they could advertise like these newfangled foods like baking powder and cocoa, like, that was a new thing then, like, baking chocolate and things like that, gelatin, powdered gelatin. So she could not
So
only talk about that, but she taught in the schools. Fanny Farmer's another one that everyone generally knows. She would,
yeah,
I don't know
farm.
that she went around as much, but she was, because she had
Right.
some kind of it was tougher for her to get around, but she definitely taught classes. So
Becky, I'm gonna switch gears in one sec, but
yeah,
you just mentioned about all these sort of ingredients that emerged during this time. Like, what would be something that we use? I mean, maybe you just mentioned that, but something that bakers use today that they take for granted that really came of age during this time.
definitely baking powder and baking soda.
Okay.
They call them chemical leavenings that
Hmm.
make baked goods rise that we put in almost any baked good today, but they didn't have that before about the mid 1900s. So, it was just really, I'm sorry, the mid 1800s.
Okay.
Um, and it was really tough to make a baked good rise if you didn't have that leavening. So you would have to use eggs, whip them into a foam, and the bubbles from the eggs would make the cake rise, or you would use yeast. So it took forever to
For
process. I know. So
so interesting.
that was it. That was really important during that time frame. So
Wow. Yeah, it definitely was an era of transformation. Who would have known it was a
mhm,
transformation in cooking? Um,
yeah.
so we're talking about debutantes, and so that brings us to some of the famous families that we talk about a lot here at the Newport Mansions, and families that spent summers here in Newport. Becky, which historical figures or families would you consider having had the most influence on Gilded Age holiday traditions, cooking or otherwise?
Yeah. I mean, I think honestly, like if you're talking about some of those really wealthy families, I know the Vanderbilts because they actually, like I said, they actually helped kind of fund some of these cooking schools. So, and some of their, the cousins or, there were so many Vanderbilts eventually, but some of those young women really
Right.
actually liked to attend the cooking schools. So, that really helped in terms of, I think, probably getting their enrollment. And then they actually really knew and liked to cook apparently a little bit.
Why would they
It
fund, why would the Vanderbilts, I mean, maybe I should ask our curators here, but why would the Vanderbilts fund a cooking school?
Yeah, I think it was just something they were always looking for something to give back to,
Sure.
like
Okay.
a charitable, and it just was something that was dear to their hearts, I guess. I don't know how it ever really came about, but it definitely was something that really really helped. But in terms of like if we're talking, that's one of the famous families, but like there's historical figures that were important too. Like actually Abraham Lincoln is the one that proclaimed Thanksgiving as a national holiday. So if we're talking Thanksgiving, he had a big part of that. And this woman, her name was Sarah Josepha Hale, and she was the editor of Godey's Ladies Book, and she
Right.
had this campaign for 17 years to kind of, say that to him. We should make Thanksgiving a national holiday. So she was an advocate for that. So she helped that. And then other figures like, frankly, the Christmas tree really came about here because Americans saw in England Queen Victoria and Prince Albert setting up a Christmas tree that was a German tradition, and Prince Albert brought that over to England, and then it just came over to America. And plus, all the immigrants that were coming here from countries such as Germany and other parts of Europe, people wanted to do that tradition and keep it up.
Right.
So um, that's a big thing. And I always say Charles Dickens. I really do. That's really Victorian area, but the Christmas Carol really helped
Sure.
Americans see. Okay, these are the charming things that we need to do over the holidays.
Was
So
it just the sheer number of European immigrants that had such an influence on Christmas traditions here in this country? I mean, European Christmas traditions really were like thoroughly embraced during the Gilded Age. Was that the reason why, or was it? I mean, if you look at some of the historic properties in our portfolio at the Newport Mansions, some of the families, they just want, just to sound crass and not a historian, but they just wanted to look like European royalty.
Hmm.
Who had sort of the greater influence on, existing and new Americans embracing these European Christmas traditions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was actually kind of regional, especially at first. You do have people from Germany, like near where I live, actually, they called them the Pennsylvania German. We call it Pennsylvania Dutch now, and they brought a lot of traditions, like out, in Pennsylvania.
Hmm.
Um, Here in New York, you had a lot of Dutch influence because that's, New Amsterdam, that a lot of New York was founded by the Dutch, so you had all their influence. Places like I know in New Jersey they had a Scandinavian influence, so it really depended. And then it was, kind of concentrated there, and then it fanned out as people got more mobile and started spreading out, around the US. But then, and then England too had a lot, you know, um, of influence here, people from Great Britain. So all of those cultures were at first concentrated and then they spread out, is how I was able to see it.
Right, right. And did Gilded Age literature at the time, like Clement Moore's poem "A Visit from St. Nicholas" and the Thomas Nast, those editorial cartoons, did they play a big role in kind of shaping how people viewed Christmas, both then and kind of influenced how it is viewed today?
They definitely didn't. I didn't realize how much, honestly, because Thomas Nast, who you may have seen his pictures that he drew for Harper's magazine, he kind of depicted Santa Claus, but he used a visit from St. Nicholas as kind of his template for what he thought Santa should look like. And ironically, at first he drew him as this little tiny elf kind of figure.
I like that,
And
Santa.
then, yeah, and they even had a picture. He drew a picture. He's like propped up against a pillow or something. Like he's so tiny. But then eventually, over time, it morphed into this, jolly man with the white beard, and he lives at the North Pole and has 8 reindeer and all of that. So
Did
he
that
just,
was that embraced? Was that embraced immediately, or was kind of a sort of a slow adaptation of
yeah,
as sort of being the figurehead of the holiday?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. His drawings were from about 1863 to 1886. So we're talking right in the
Mhm.
heart of the Gilded Age. And I think it probably took all those years to really come into the common, vernacular or whatever. But yeah, I mean, after that point, I feel like you really start to see it. People even would dress up as Santa. That's when you start to see, even like in department stores and things, somebody dressing up as Santa. Somebody in the household might do it for the kids in the household. Even Mark Twain would do it occasionally for his kids. So I think it just, the whole image, that was the time when it
Right.
really came about.
And
So
did that, I mean, this is sort of like circular thinking, but did that, and I keep thinking, and maybe this is just me being a marketing cynic, but there's been such commercialization of the holidays, as the sort of the mythology of Santa Claus grew. Did companies use that to sort of leverage and then influence what people thought to cook for for Christmas dinner specifically, when to cook, and was it sort of like a symbiotic relationship? How did that work, or was there any effect at all?
yeah, I think so. I didn't look at a whole huge amount of ads, but I actually have one in my cookbook about, there's a picture of Santa with oranges. So the orange industry also exploded at this
Sure.
time, in the warmer in Florida and California. And then the railroads could bring them to all different places, and they actually have an orange in your stocking and Santa's there in the
Those are my
advertisement.
stockings.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah. Um so, there's that. I
So,
did see that one, but and I'm sure that there were others, and there were Christmas cards too that came out
Sure.
as being more popular, and you'd start to see Santa on the card. So yeah, and there, now that I think of it, I did see more like trade cards, they called them,
Right.
for different products and things. Yeah.
So yeah, you have these things that are kind of showing up, and when people, whether you're wealthy or not, you think of Christmas, you think of Santa Claus, and you think of something like what you just mentioned. You think of an orange or what have you. Like what foods back then were just ubiquitous when it came to Christmas and maybe even Thanksgiving as well. We can sort of expand it a little bit,
Hmm.
regardless of your place in the economic spectrum. Like what foods were absolutely, whether you were the Vanderbilts or you were somebody who was living in one of the tenements in New York City, what absolutely had to make its way onto your table during Thanksgiving and or Christmas?
I do think, and I know I mentioned it before, but the plum pudding was really popular depending on what socioeconomic level you were. And you definitely see that. There was even a fun activity called Stir Up Sunday, where the family members would come home from church on Sunday. It was like the last Sunday before Advent started. And that's when they would mix up the plum pudding. And every person in the household would make a wish, and sometimes they'd even put charms in there, and then whoever got the
In the
charm,
pudding?
yeah, later on, like they could have fun charms, like a thimble. If you got that, that meant, oh, you might be a spinster, or a ring could mean, oh, you're going to get married. So it just depends. I'm sure like that's more the wealthier people, not
That's funny.
the poor people. But and then they would hang it up in the pudding cloth, and it would mature in those last few weeks before Christmas because the flavors could blend and all of that. So that was a big activity, and I think most families would have that. I do think a turkey or something, some kind of roast, if
Right.
whatever you could have, I did see too, like on most holiday tables. It's just that they had, like I said, so many more courses
Right.
and other for the wealthy.
Right.
Absolutely.
I should know the answer to this question, and I think probably my third grade teacher is having fits right now. But I'm thinking of Thanksgiving. Do you know, like, why turkey? How did that become the thing?
Yeah, I mean, I know, and I have to go back to my research on that. Because honestly, like, and I researched this too. There's so many different stories. The first Thanksgiving really wasn't what they always say, and
How so? How so?
I mean, we think about, oh, the Indians or the Native American people came with the Pilgrims, and all of that, um, and bought their bounty, and it did happen. There were like days of Thanksgiving, like that they used to proclamations and everything that
Hmm.
happened later. But this initial one, I'd have to go back in my research because I know I wrote about it in the first cookbook. But they had things like fish and other like it was like a harvest kind of
Right.
festival.
Right.
And I think there were wild turkeys, but and it could just stem from that, but I'm not really sure exactly how it just stuck.
Right.
um because even overseas, I actually lived in England for a couple of years. They have a turkey for Christmas, which is kind of weird because it's not indigenous to Europe. It's
Right.
turkeys come from America, so but they started to really like that idea. So you'll see that on their Christmas tables today.
Interesting. What
Yeah. So
what sort of dishes, whether Thanksgiving or Christmas, what sort of dishes were served back then that I had mentioned turtle soup earlier, which I think
hmm
some people may still enjoy. I've never had it. It's probably delicious, maybe not. But what dishes served back then would we sort of look at sideways today and think, "Yeesh, for real?"
right. I mean, turtle soup definitely is one. I've written about that a lot, talk about that a lot. I don't know that that would show up as much on a holiday table, believe it or not.
Yeah.
Um, but they definitely had it, all the time back then. At first, it was green turtle. Then they moved into terrapin because the green turtles got overfished. And then they actually moved into mock turtle soup, which
What is
is
that? What is that?
cat. I
I'm not,
know.
this is probably not appropriate for this interview. What is the difference between a terrapin and a turtle?
So a terrapin is the smaller
Okay, got it.
turtles,
All right,
and the
thanks.
green sea
I'll edit that part out.
turtles. No, a green sea turtle is like the really big, like you see in Finding Nemo.
Oh,
There are
got it.
those
Okay.
huge
Oh,
I
oh,
know. They used
oh,
to eat
Becky.
every part of that turtle they would eat. I'm not kidding. They loved
Oh
that.
my
They
gosh.
said it tasted like they called it Barbados beef. It tasted like veal. They said they loved it.
Wow.
Um,
What else? I know I was on a with one of our curators recently, and there was a discussion about pickled oysters, which I
yeah,
thought was peculiar.
I was gonna say oysters were free, like fine dining table, and even
Okay.
there were also oyster bars in places, like in New York City and other cities. So that was a food that could be, for the elite, and just it was a street food too.
Right.
But the pickled version, and that just makes it can store it longer, kind of
Sure.
thing. Something else I mean, we don't look at it askance necessarily, but celery was on Thanksgiving and Christmas tables as like a luxury. So
Wow.
I
Okay.
know. So because it
I
was
feel
hard
much
to
better about my
grow.
lunch choices now.
I always say it's like the last thing on the crudité platter that's taken, or people have buffalo wings and they throw away the the celery stick.
They don't know how good they have it. You've got to
I
tell them,
know.
Becky. We're gonna get them to buy your
Yeah.
books. You know, Becky,
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
new book covers Christmas celebrations beyond the sort of European influenced ones that we talked about here, right? And can you talk a little bit about examples of Gilded Age, or was there Gilded Age Hanukkah, or any Black American Christmas traditions that occurred?
Sure. So it was during the Gilded Age that Hanukkah really became more widespread, prevalent throughout the United States, because Jewish people were seeing, the Christians celebrate Christmas, and really thought, well, we want some of these festivities as well. And Hanukkah was the one holiday that fell at that time of year. So they just started celebrating it more. And, you know, in terms of holiday presents, they had the tradition of giving gelt to the needy and giving some to children. So they would, do that. Some of the temples would have these celebrations, with including children. They would serve them ice cream, that kind of thing. So they just wanted that whole kind of festive feeling and
Sure.
have that Christmas cheer kind of, feeling. So it was nice to see that this is when it was starting to become mainstream too.
Right. And the Black
Definitely.
African diaspora in the U.S., were there traditions and celebrations during the holidays to counter the more traditional European Christmas or Thanksgiving
Yeah,
tradition?
so there was, the Black elite loved having, they had debutante balls,
Hmm.
places like Philadelphia, New York, Washington, D.C., had balls and all kinds of events for the holidays, and had these clubs with membership where, same, similar to the white elite where you're
Sure.
restricted kind of thing, but all kinds of social clubs and activities, and charitable giving too. They
Right.
did the same thing. So yeah.
So I'm thinking, of course, we're talking about cuisine. You're a food historian. Food, Gilded Age Hanukkah, food during sort of, Black American, Black African celebrations. Where did those influences come from?
Yeah, so I couldn't find a whole lot of foods that were tied to Hanukkah. They
Hmm.
had, and I have to pronounce it correctly, sufganiyot, which are jelly donuts that you see still today, a lot of
Okay.
times associated with Hanukkah. And then you also have the latkes, so the
Hmm.
potato pancakes, and that because they were fried in oil to symbolize the amount of oil that lasted for 8 days,
Right.
through Hanukkah. So you see those two things pop up. And then other things to go along with the Hanukkah celebrations, like fruit, tea, coffee, and as I mentioned, ice cream. So
Hmm.
those are the kinds of things. Um, for the Black celebrations, I didn't see necessarily so many foods associated with them. It was more
Okay.
about the dressing up
Sure.
and having the balls and, all these really fun different parties and things like that. There were, like, they talked about a champagne punch, and I'm sure it was a lot of the same foods that you would see at any Gilded Age ball. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Becky, during your time as a food historian and you're doing this research, Has your research influenced your own cooking? Do you, I mean, I'll just say, well, do you cook at home? That might be a silly question, but I'm just gonna say, do you consider yourself a chef? Do you cook at home?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely cook at home and I love to cook. I probably like cooking better than baking a little bit just because I
Okay,
like to try to be creative
sure.
with cooking and mixing flavors together, and I love just trying all different flavor combinations.
Right.
And luckily my
During your
husband's a good
during your
taster.
during your research, did you come across something and say, I have to try that?
Oh, that's a good question. Some of the, baked goods, like some of these cakes, I
Mhm.
did, say, wow, like, and I learned this early on, the flavorings were different then. Like they had a lot of baked goods that featured things like rose water, orange blossom water, you know, lemon flavoring. Lemon was such a more common flavoring. So I wanted to try some of these baked goods and see, what do these taste, why did they really like these flavors? And they are delicious together. Rose water with some spices like nutmeg, cinnamon. There's in a lot of cookies. It's a really delicious combination. So there's a lot of those dishes that I've tried over the years. But
I'm letting our listeners know that this interview is happening about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which is really the witching hour in terms of people's
yeah.
hunger. So this is not doing a lot of things for my hunger right now. Becky, we're almost out of time. I did want to ask you one thing. Do you watch
Yeah.
HBO's The Gilded Age?
Yes.
Yeah. And what is I'm assuming your favorite parts of those scenes, especially we can see in back of me the Elms kitchen.
hmm
What do
As
you, your own interpretation, right? You're watching that as just a fan, but you've spent so much time with your head in books researching this era. Did Julian Fellows, does he get it right? Is it pretty accurate?
I do feel like it's the food has been pretty spot on, absolutely. But having said that, I would love to be a consultant on their show. But one thing I really noticed this past season when Gladys was getting married and they had the chef Borden and he proposed to Mrs. Bruce. It was so sad. In that little side area
Yeah,
there. And there was a croquembouche in the background and
right.
her wedding cake. And then I also saw, they had platters of just a whole fish with these skewers on top, and that's absolutely the types of foods they would have had for that kind of event. So
Amazing.
I do, and I look for that definitely. I freeze frame, and I'm like, oh, look at that, kind of thing. So, and that way I can like do a little reel or something too,
Right.
because then it's something to talk about, and I love that they're featuring food in the
Yeah.
TV show.
And
So
there's
yeah.
a whole lot of it in that TV show. That's great
Yeah.
that you think that way. Anyway, Becky, by the time this interview airs, you will have been to Newport, taking part in the Newport Symposium, the French influence in Newport. We can't wait for you to come here. I just wanted to remind everybody that Becky Diamond's new book, The Gilded Age Christmas Book, is currently out. You can find it well stocked in any of the 5 Newport Mansions stores, including our main store down on Bannister's Wharf in Newport. And we thank you so much, Becky, for your time. This has been a lot of fun. I am starving right now. So as soon as we conclude this interview, I'm going to go get something to eat, not turtle soup, but I'm going to get something to eat. Anyway, thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Great. That's great. We'll see you when you're here.
Okay,
All
sounds
right.
great.